Hello, this is the Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative perspective about the world around me. So feedback is immensely important, and especially with the holidays coming up. Well, Christmas is right around the corner, New Year's, and so forth. If you have holiday stories you want to share or show ideas, feel free to reach out to me. And the best way to do that is through email. All right, so some of the audio platforms that I'm on Speaker, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Deezer, just to name a few. Okay, so it's Friday, so I'm focusing in on all of you. This time I'm featuring the language of the Vietnamese language. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to just tell you some thoughts that I have and then get into the facts. All right, so you know how they say the concept of image is important. Image is everything. You got to spend money to make money, so forth. There's a lot of different assorted phrases that they basically all mean the same thing. And so history is another precursor to image. It's whether you want to look back and focus on it, or if you want to be prevalent in light and the flourishment of your culture and of other people's endowment and the betterment of others, push forward and rechange the aspects. Vietnam is a really good example of that. That in certain companies, the idea and the thought process of Vietnam is quite different towards other generations. And so what I mean by that in the aspects of war, as I said previously when talking about language and how it changes it brings up different ideas and different concepts about communication, about words and phrases. And more prevalent is the Vietnam War, and then how it was seen from a multitude of lenses, particularly with the aspects of Vietnam, the Vietnam people, and versus their disposition about it. And it's quite interesting with the aspects of the cultural establishment of Vietnam. Because, you have so many different, and that goes without saying with language. If you a truly flourishing language is influenced by many different cultures. And then Vietnam is, among one. Not only with the Chinese influence, which is, sort of the dominant aspects of, the ancient dialect, but, we have French and so forth. And then also on the other side of this, when you're talking about the business point of view, Vietnam was able to do that, was able to, get over the hump and then move on and flourish. And from what I understand, and to have an aspect of being more capitalist driven and more commercialized. And that's a really big, feat considering the obstacles that was right in front of them. And especially the culinary landscape of Vietnamese food, and then the the imagery and the ideas and the concepts about Vietnamese culture and language. When you get pho, and then when you get bao minh, I'm trying to say the sandwiches and the different aspects and details that comes with sandwiches. And then, with the French influence with the bread and all of that. And then also another really pivotal aspects of the Vietnam language is diphthongs. And the aspects of tonal language really means and sets the cursor of how things are perceived in the Vietnamese language. And I can't stress enough that it's just so fascinating to me, to where, as I said it before, but I'll restate this again. In the American language, okay, you have the concept of there, and there. They mean completely different. They're spelled differently, but they sound the same, and they mean different. They have different aspects of meaning depending on how it's spelled, versus a language like the Vietnamese language, most Asian language. The tonal imagery in which you stress something changes the meaning of something. And with this said, I am going to dip in and talk about the aspects of the Vietnamese language. Here we go. Okay, of course, sources will be provided for you. All right, so let's just dive in here. So it says, this is the AI generated response. It says the Vietnamese language originated as a part of the Austroasiatic language family. Specifically when the Viet Minh subgroup of the Viet branch, which is also a part of the broader Hmong Khmer group of languages spoken across Midland South Asia. Linguistic research indicates that the earliest ancestors of the Vietnamese people were known as the Lac Viet, which they inhabited the Red River Delta region as early as the first millennia of BCE. And their language already exhibited core Austroasiatic features such as monosyllabic roots, subject, verb, object, SVO, word order, and lack of inflection. So the language evolved from Proto-Vitic, the common ancestor of modern Vietnamese and other Vitic languages, with early speakers migrating from central Vietnam to the northern mountain regions and eventually settling in the Red River Delta. The Red River Delta is, encompasses a lot of different aspects of cultures too, when you get into that arena. And so that's a whole, before I get too far off the subject, it kind of, relates into the aspects, cultures that live near water versus ones that live more, near land and the territory. Territories really subject and give the foundation of language as well, of a culture, because of what they, it's really true. What you see is all what you know. And it's really unfortunate. Some people can get in the habit of being disingenuous about this. So what am I saying? So what's so wrong? I'm going to, talk more about this in other months, particularly leading towards the month of February and so forth, and leaking that out to other months. But primarily here, the aspects of cultural values towards something. So braids. Some people, And the other day, I heard a YouTuber saying, white people who have braids essentially is cultural appropriation. So how is it cultural appropriation when, braids essentially aren't something that is, it became that, but they are not, defined to the reality of the subject that braids are not just subjected to a certain culture, which happens to be African American culture. If you go back, which I stress very prevalent in my podcast here, my radio show here. If you go back in time in history, you can see that there is a multitude of different cultures that embrace the aspects of braids simply because of the region, the territory that it was just something that made common sense to have braids. When you talk about the Romans, Greeks, and then the list goes on. There are depictions of people of them, women, men wearing braids. So how does that link together? So relate this back to what I just said. What you see is, and how you describe things and how you relate to other people is of human nature. And so that is involved in the aspects of developing language from my point of view too. I mean, this is kind of, it goes without saying, this is sort of common sense here, really. But it's just, this adds to the point of how just fundamentally valuable language is. And then when people go away from it and they try to change language to meet their own perspective or so forth, or, when language gets changed to meet certain cultural values. At the root or the heart of the matter, that stems from what you see, what you understand. And then to not have value in that is really going against human nature. And that's something to, subject to in the aspects of language here. And then, others. All right, so it says the Vietnamese language shares significant vocabulary and structural similarities with related languages such as Hmong and Khmer, with words like Tay, hand, and having cognates in the Hmong, Thai, and Khmer, Thai. Over time, the language derived from its closer relative Hmong, particularly during the 10th and 11th centuries, as a result of prolonged contact with Chinese culture and language during over a millennia of Chinese domination, which spans from 11 BCE all the way to 939 BC. So during this period, Chinese characters became the official script, and thousands of Chinese words were adopted into Vietnamese, forming a Sino-Vietnamese vocabulary, which now consists of a large portion of the modern lexicon. Despite Chinese influences, Vietnamese maintain a distinct identity in response to the Chinese rule. Vietnamese scholars developed Chu Mom in the 13th century as a script based on adapted Chinese characters and the use of native Vietnamese words and expressions, allowing the creation of a rich literary tradition, including the national epic, The Tale of the Q. This most transformative development came from the creation of said language. So a Latin, which is the Chu Kul Nagu, which this is a Latin-based script introduced by the Catholic missionaries such as Alexandre de Rhodes in the 17th century. So the script, which accurately represents Vietnamese tones using the diacritics, gradually replaced Chinese and the Chu Mom, especially during French colonial rule, which was officially adopted after the August Revolution of 1945, becoming a standard script for education and national community. So today, Vietnamese is spoken over 90 million by over 90 million people in Vietnam and millions more worldwide, reflecting history of resilience, adaptation, and cultural pride. So I'm going to dig into talking about more onto this here. So it says, and this is entitled The Origin of the Vietnamese Language. And so I'm going to just go dive right into this. So traveling to a foreign country whose language isn't alphabetic is never all that easy. So they say, just imagine the challenge of typing down let me try that again here. They say, just imagine the challenge of going down a street name or trying to type the street name in Google Maps. That's quite daunting. Asking the locals for directions will surely be another struggle. Fortunately, that's something you don't have to worry about if your destination is Vietnam. So they say Vietnam language has a Latin-based alphabet, making it similar to Russian language. You will likely not have any problem copying addresses and booking ride services, even though you may not speak the language. So, why does Vietnamese use the Latin alphabet? It's somewhat a modern appearance, and it's the fruit of a long and difficult journey, and it is accompanied by Vietnamese people throughout history, which fills with the upheaval and the rivalries as well as prosperity. So all of these experience enhances Vietnamese official language as of today, which also leaves traces in its structure and expressions. All right, so at first glance, the Vietnamese language appears to have many close resemblance to Chinese in both its lexical system and the phonics of the rules. So 70% of the Vietnamese vocabulary has Chinese origins, making it up to what is known as the Han Viet lexicon. So examples of the Han Viet words are for instance, saying body, the pong, room, ha, summer, and etc. So these words are used just as widely as the native Vietnamese vocabulary. So their pronunciation is also systematically relates to Chinese equivalents to this. So in 1830, J.L. Tebard, a priest and appointed missionary in modern Vietnam, improved on the works of earlier priests in the lexicographers, namely improving on, as I mentioned earlier, Alex D. Rose. And it published his own Vietnamese Latin dictionary called the Dictionarium of the Anatomical Latium. In this work, Tabert suggested that Vietnamese was actually a variation of the version of Chinese. From this point of view, Vietnamese would be considered part of the Chinese language family. So is Vietnamese similar to Chinese? Let's see. Getting into a closer look, it says that they say that look at the Vietnamese lexical system, which reveals the massive Han Viet lexicon mentioned above. While substantially consisting of a lot of loan words, indeed the Han Viet vocabulary is primarily a cultural lexicon, which is quite separate from the core lexicon of the Vietnamese language. This reveals that despite heavy Chinese cultural influences, Vietnamese retain their own linguistic independence. So only borrowing vocabulary where needed rather than being wholly assimilated to it. That's quite interesting with the aspects of, again, as I stated, what you wear, what you eat, and in these terms, your language really separates you from the bunch. and to hold on to the aspects of understanding that to its core in this case really says a lot about the cultural value of Vietnamese, where, simply because they borrowed to shape their language from Chinese culture doesn't mean necessarily that they are completely assimilating or just becoming Chinese culture. They're deriving their own values within and how they want to speak and develop their own language. Some frequently used Han Viet words appear to belong to the core lexicon. So, however, the number of such cases is insignificant, and the association between those words and their Chinese equivalents often lack the systematic aspects of it. So, for example, the word Dao, which means head, might have origins from the Chinese word, but within the same system of the basic vocabulary used to denotate similar organs, there are no Chinese equivalents such as the phonetic resemble of the mat, which is eye, and the mu, nose, or toe, hair. So ancient Chinese documents tell a similar story. So according to the book of the Latter Han, which is a 15th century history book written by the famous Chinese historian Fang Ye, during the 1st century, people living in the Go Chai, the former name, which would become Vietnam, and the people in the Central Plains, which is a large part of what has become China, and spoke different languages. So to communicate, they required multiple translators, including Vietnamese and Chinese, and they were unlikely to have the same origin. So grouping Vietnamese together with Chinese thus proves to be a weaker argument from the viewpoint of a comparative historical linguistics. So, with that said, I am going to end here. So I would like to know what you all think about this episode. Feel free to reach out to me. All right, so tune in, turn up, and take care. And have a very Merry Christmas and Happy Cheers to a new year.